You're listening to The Vault, a forum communications podcast covering true crime and general intrigue in the upper Midwest. I'm your host, Trisha Turinskis. Intermittent fasting. It's all the rage right now in the wellness industry. Now, there are, it seems, health benefits related to the practice of fasting. I am not a medical professional, and I'm not here to give you advice. But I have seen myself and those close to me benefit in many ways from fasting. At this point, you might be wondering what this has to do with true crime. Well, on today's episode, we look at what happens when a health professional takes fasting recommendations too far, and people start dying. That was the case for an osteopath out of Fergus Falls, Minnesota, who was responsible for the death of at least 14 people. Was she a serial killer? That's up for you to decide. Today's story is brought to you by Tammy Swift, a columnist and reporter out of the Fargo Forum. I want to add here that I've long been a fan of Tammy's writing style, and it's a pleasure to feature her story on the podcast today. Here is part 1 in a 2-part series on the Starvation Doctor. Linda Hazzard was a force of nature. She stood nearly as tall as her 6-foot husband, although some wondered if her personality was so imposing that she simply seemed larger than she actually was. She was a formidable figure, with sharp cheekbones, a resolute chin, and an unflinching gaze. Everything about Linda exuded authority. She spoke with unwavering assurance, as if she were absolutely right, and anyone who disagreed with her was a fool. She was studying osteopathy in her quest to become a nurse, and she became convinced that drastic fasting, ingesting only thin vegetable broths for weeks or even months, was the key to healing all disease. Linda's followers, who included prominent intellectuals and politicians, swore by her methods and proclaimed her a gifted and intelligent healer. Others considered her a serial killer. From 1907 to 1913, at least 14 Washington residents under her care died of starvation. That's according to the Washington State Archives. That death count doesn't include the number of patients who died in Minnesota. Even more suspiciously, some of her patients turned over property, money, guardianship, and power of attorney to Linda and her husband Samuel before they died. Linda seemed to possess some unseen hold over her patients, which was so powerful that they would turn over possessions and refuse to eat, even in the most advanced stages of starvation. Linda would grow so notorious that the primitive sanitarium she built in Olalla, Washington, became known by locals as Starvation Heights. That's also the title of a book on Linda by Greg Olson, a true crime author who lives in Olalla. Even more surprising is that Linda's life started out in such an unremarkable way. She wasn't the child of a snake oil salesman or soothsayer, but a Minnesota-reared farm girl. Linda was born in 1867 in Minnesota's Carver County to Susan Neal Burfield and Montgomery Burfield, a former corporal in the 9th Minnesota Infantry during the Civil War. The family headed west to homestead at Star Lake Township in Ottertail County 10 years later, where Montgomery ran a log mill. Linda, also called Lana, was the oldest of 7 children. Even early on, she had no shortage of confidence and was known as an outgoing tomboy who was her father's favorite. A Fergus Falls Daily Journal article in 1931 ran a pretty unsparing yet completely unattributed portrait of Linda, even as a young girl. She was a strange child, and her parents were told she would do weird things and lead an unusual life. From the first, it was evident she was different from other children. She was inclined to be haughty, high-strung, and visionary. Linda spent many hours commuting with herself instead of joining with the others in their childish activities. The Burfields did have some unusual inclinations for the time and place. They maintained a mostly vegetarian diet at a time when standard Midwestern farm fare was meat and potatoes. Although no one in the Barfield clan was sickly, Montgomery Burfield decided his children needed to see a real doctor. During a house call, a local physician convinced Linda's parents that the children all had potentially deadly intestinal parasites. He prescribed blue mass pills, which were administered for several years and induced bouts of severe vomiting and diarrhea. Linda would one day condemn the treatment for causing irreparable injury to her intestines. She was underweight, tired, and could barely keep food down. The doctors prescribed a purgative called calomel to address her stomach ailments, which she later blamed for causing the loss of many of her upper teeth. This early health scare sparked her interest in finding alternative health treatments. By 18, Linda married Irwin Perry, who was 14 years her senior. They moved to Fergus Falls, Minnesota, where Irwin owned a business. They had 2 children, Roland in 1889 and Nina Floy in 1891. Linda's interest in the marriage soon faded. She felt like she was destined for something greater. The 1931 Daily News article reported that Linda immediately became socially ambitious, demanded the best clothes, the smartest turnouts from her husband's stables, and made a determined effort to associate with a better class of people. The article reported that her desire for making a show got the Perrys into financial difficulties. In 1898, Linda claimed that Irwin abandoned her, although those who knew Linda best believed otherwise. Eventually, she shipped off her children to her mother, Susan, in Star Lake. Some say her ambitions got the best of her. Also in 1898, Linda discovered fasting by reading The Gospel of Health, written by Dr. Edward Hooker Dewey. In it, Dewey praised the restorative power of fasting. Dewey believed the path to health was to let the digestive system rest, so the body could rid itself of toxins, which caused imbalances in the body. Linda believed Dewey's system restored her health. The ambitious young woman moved to Minneapolis, where she could work as an osteopath and spread her own, more extreme version of Dewey's methods. She claimed her fasting regimen could cure everything from toothaches and constipation to Bright's disease. Linda entered the health game at a time when more Americans were exploring alternative therapies. One of the best known of those was John Harvey Kellogg, the American physician Cornflakes King, who in 1876 opened a sanitarium which offered hydrotherapy, light therapy, sexual abstinence, and yogurt enemas. Linda's methods were more sadistic. She prescribed a draconian regimen of marathon fasts, brutal massages, some likened them more to beatings, vigorous walks, hours-long enemas, and nearly scalding baths to treat people's ills. Some of Burfield's patients actually did improve, and her Minneapolis practice enjoyed some success. But others couldn't survive Linda's harsh protocol. Gertrude Young, who was 41, was paralyzed on her right side due to a stroke. The Minneapolis woman had sought help from a number of doctors, but still struggled with basic tasks such as dressing herself. When she heard of Linda, she had hoped for a miracle cure. She began the doctor's fasting regimen in mid-October 1902. 3 weeks later, the patient woke to violent fits of vomiting. The nurse tending Young grew so concerned that she contacted another doctor, Eugene Williams, who was also Hennepin County's coroner. Alarmed by Young's yellowish skin and sunken physique, he urged the woman to immediately break the fast. By then, some of Young's friends and fasting proponents had gathered in her bedroom to protest the recommendation. Young, along with the Linda groupies, vehemently insisted that the fast could only be broken on the 40th day. Young never got to see that day. She died on November 18th, the 39th day of her fast. Linda attributed the cause of death to paralysis. The outraged coroner ordered an inquest. A postmortem was held at the University of Minnesota, where scientists reported the cause of death as starvation. The woman had wasted down to 105 pounds and, strangely enough, had virtually no blood left in her body. Criminal charges were considered but never brought. Her family, meanwhile, wondered what had happened to the deceased woman's jewelry, which included valuable rings. Linda scoffed at the notion she would steal anything. She insisted Young had given the rings to a nurse. although the nurse was never found. In efforts of damage control, Linda summoned a reporter. When he asked if she had a medical license, Linda dramatically declared, "Thank God I have no license to kill." She also claimed that, due to fasting, Young had regained free use of her right arm and foot, but refused to let Linda examine her. When Linda persisted in examining her, the patient confessed that not only had she failed to follow her instructions to the letter, but that she had been diagnosed with an incurable disease by another doctor. It became a popular Linda defense. When a patient died, she insisted they already had some serious disease or underlying condition which had progressed too far for fasting to cure. While in Minneapolis, Linda also met the love of her life. Samuel Hazzard was a tall, handsome man with coal-black hair, a dashing black mustache, and a ramrod-straight posture. He was a former Army lieutenant. He dressed impeccably and made a gentlemanly first impression. But anyone who looked beyond Samuel's tailored facade learned he was neither military hero nor gentleman. He destroyed his promising military career by racking up unpaid bills around New York, forging documents, lying about the family emergencies to get leave, and misappropriating Army funds. He also abandoned his first wife and their children. Samuel rarely bothered with details such as divorce before romancing and marrying another woman. Perhaps that's why he sometimes used the name Hargrave on his marriage licenses. The Minneapolis papers breathlessly covered a scandalous trial when he was tried for bigamy for being married to both Linda and an Iowa woman. In February of 1904, Samuel was sent off to the state prison in Stillwater for bigamy. The Iowa woman wrote letters to the warden asking how she could make Samuel's time in prison easier and paid for a gold tooth when he needed dental work. But when he was released, he went straight home to Linda. Once again, through sheer force of will, Linda had triumphed. Over time, man and wife both might wonder if it was a victory. Samuel would become so dominated by his wife that he learned to simply agree with whatever she said. And Samuel, the cheater, also became Samuel the tippler, who had his alcoholism by drinking bottles of vanilla extract. By 1907, the Hazzards had bid farewell to the Twin Cities and headed to Washington State. Although Linda was not a medical doctor, she was able to get a license to practice medicine through a loophole that grandfathered in some practitioners of alternative medicine without degrees. Dr. Hazzard could now pursue her dream of building a renowned health institute where patients from near and far could fast their troubles away. Stay tuned for part 2 on the Starvation Doctor.